Nice Radio Kalaloo presents Just Another Look. Just Another Look is an innovative, exciting, albeit decidedly provocative and yes, certainly controversial, socio-political analysis of issues of a local, regional, and international nature. Just Another Look is heard only on Nice Radio. First aired on Saturdays at 6 p.m. with repeat broadcasts on Sundays at 9 p.m. You can always catch us on the World Wide Web, www.niceradio.info, or you can check out our Just Another Look blog, www.justanotherlook.com. I am, of course, Keith Joseph. Today is Saturday. It is the 16th day of June 2018. Welcome to another edition of your favorite program, Just Another Look. St. Vincent and the Grenadines continues as a nation to make significant declines. We're declining in so many areas that it is difficult for some people to see light at the end of the tunnel. But when you say so, the protagonists of change who were protagonists in the 1970s through the Black Power period, and those who flirted with socialism and other ideologies are now the ones in charge. They've been in charge for more than 17 years. And if they were to hanker back to their quote-unquote most radical days, they would probably be ashamed of what they have become. So it is either they were fooling around with different ideologies in the past, or that they were deliberately duping the then populace into believing that they were in fact radical, they were in fact committed, and that if given the opportunity, they would impact the nation positively. But you see, what was missing from their radical days was a genuine commitment to the democratic process. In large measure, rather than be democratic, if you hanker back to the same people who are now in charge, you will probably recognize that in the midst of their radicalism, there was a major conflict in respect of the perception of others and the commitment of others to the same cause. In hindsight, though, the critical issue may well have been one of leadership. the criteria for leadership, and in particular, an emphasis on academia or perceived academia as critical to effecting change. But you know, fate, F-A-T-E, is a funny thing. Because sometimes, you know, the old people say, be careful what you ask for, you just might get it. And so Gonzalez got what he wanted, to become the leader of government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But one wonders to what extent he feels comfortable when looking at himself in the mirror today. Is he really what he wanted to be? Is he really? Is he satisfied with what he sees? And if he finds time at all to reflect on his leadership for the past 17 years, can he ever really be satisfied? And maybe this is why it is so necessary for him to write his own books, because he can then give his own account of where he thinks he took this country. But writing your own history is one thing. What history writes about you is another, because that you cannot always dictate. The old people say monkey can't see your own tail. And perhaps that is where Gonzalez and the Unity Labour Party have reached. Like James Mitchell in his latter years in office, Gonzalez and his entourage seem to have grown tired and incapable of managing the ship of state in an approved manner. Vincentians are crying out for change. And it's the reason why when you examine the last 10 years of ULP governance, the last 13 years of ULP governance, it has been a pulling and tugging and pulling and tugging, not between themselves, but pulling and tugging in respect of exactly how best they could try to manage a Vincentian economy, which under them has failed to make significant growth. The progress that they promised has not been made. And in the midst of it, their most critical commitment prior to 2001's general election was for integrity legislation. And one would have imagined that their commitment to change, having trumpeted against a new Democratic Party that they claimed was corrupt, that white-collar criminality in particular ran rampant, one would have imagined that they would first seek to protect themselves from themselves. And 17 years later, a lawyer of so many years' experience, a criminal lawyer of vast experience who understands the inner workings of the criminal mind, has not been able to find the wherewithal in terms of leadership to bring to the top of the priority bundle integrity legislation. You need say nothing more about the regime and its leadership when you follow that particular analysis. How is it that a leadership in opposition could have spent so much time talking about the problems associated with white-collar criminality, and that after 17 years in office has not found it possible to bring to the table integrity legislation? But you were prepared to change the constitution. You were prepared to change the constitution. Would that have been in your own image and likeness? Would that have been in your own image and likeness? So after 17 years, the ship of state continues to be what the Unity Labour Party administration has made it. A mess in many respects. You know, when one returns to the 70s and the radicalism and the ideas that emerged in the writings and the mouthings of the so-called progressives, it's difficult to understand the transformation to what they are today. We call them the ruminants of the left because that's what they are. Ruminants first and foremost, and of the left secondly. That's what they have become. They're not even a shadow of their radical selves. Not even a shadow of their radical selves. They seem to have forgotten completely all the things that they attempted to tell the youth at the time. All the things that they said to the people of this nation that scared the living daylights out of the older generations, so much so that they couldn't garner votes when they attempted to run for elections. But the transformation, their own social and political and economic transformations, would never have been understood otherwise. You cannot believe the extent to which mammon has become so important that physical structures, which in the 1960s and 70s they referred to as megalomania, has become such an integral part of their politics. And yet, they see or fail to see what they have done to this nation. How they have brought the nation to its knees. We live 20 minutes by flight away from Grenada. Totally destroyed in 2004. Totally destroyed in 2004. And yet 14 years later, we are no match for that country in terms of its economic transformation. Can you imagine that? We have been able to accept a regime that pats itself on its back when it's not thumping its chest for bringing the Vincentian economy to where it is today. And not understanding the extent to which others right around us have engaged in a transformation that we promised our people. And yet we cannot achieve it because we have focused on, like our friend says, the bigger picture, people not seeing the bigger picture. But when you look at him, you see a bigger picture, indeed, but not the bigger picture that he promised the people of this country. But you're listening to Just Another Look. You hear it only on Nice Radio. In beginning today's program, we want to spend some time asking ourselves, is Daniel Cummings a victim and an example of what constitutes good governance, ULP style? Is Daniel Cummings a victim and a good example of what good governance, ULP style means in a country like ours? You see, political analysts have long since concluded that what obtains for good governance in the Anglophone Caribbean or the English-speaking Caribbean is really prime ministerial governance, similar to what obtains in England, except that England is a lot more democratic. We are essentially operating under a prime ministerial government. And when we say that, we mean that essentially the prime minister is boss. What the prime minister say goes. There was a calypso referring to the late Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams, which says, and when I talk, no damn dog bark. That was a calypso rendered by the Mighty Sparrow. And it addressed a period when politicians belonging to the ruling party, the People's National Movement, led by Eric Williams, misbehaved in public office. They felt that Eric Williams was able to take them, relocate them, etc., and massage the process with a level of arrogance that suggested that since he knew he had the right under the Constitution to make those changes, he could make it. And that nobody dared challenge him on it. That was in the 60s and 70s. Nothing has changed. Rowley does the same thing. Michael Manley, Portia Simpson Miller, Eugenia Charles, Eric Gary, Keith Mitchell, James Mitchell. They all do the same thing. The birds in Antigua. They all act the same way. Because none of them want to so fundamentally change their respective constitutions to allow for a higher level of democracy in their respective countries. They are happy with things the way they are. And that is why we are able to tell you that, what else do you think the statement meant? Quote unquote. They could go to all the courts they want, but when they finish, they still have to come back to Papa. What do you think it meant? That is a quintessential statement about the way we are governed under our existing constitutions. It is a matter of prime ministerial government. So what the prime minister said goes. So he runs his cabinet and by extension runs the country. It's interesting when you listen to some of them speak in public, particularly when they're speaking in the presence of visitors and international media, as opposed to how they behave in parliament. Nothing that the opposition says is of any use to them. Why? Because they are in charge. And that is why Gonzalez knew, and Beach knew, and Storky John knew that in 1998, it didn't matter that James Mitchell and his NDP won by 1 seat. That is the Constitution. But they said then that they will make the country, some of them actually, not all of them, some of them said they would make the country ungovernable. Well, perhaps what we have now is a result of that intention. But they did not think that a 1-seat majority should allow the government to do what it wants. That's what they said publicly. And it may have been tongue-in-cheek because they recognize that we live under prime ministerial governance. But when they have a 1-seat majority, you dare not suggest that you will make the country ungovernable. Although nobody really wants to do that because they've done a good job for themselves. But a 1-seat majority was not good for the NDP, but it is good for the ULP. So they have been trying to convince, and we are sure that they're trying to convince themselves that in 2010, they lost 4 of their seats. So they knew then that the electorate had had enough. And for all of the campaigning and development strategies that they implemented, according to them, for the next 5 years between 2010 and 2015, they could not change the outcome in terms of garnering those seats they had lost. And so they were saying some things on the platform. They were saying that, they felt so comfortable that they were going to take back some of their seats. They were going to make inroads and leave the opposition in the dust. Instead, they got back the same results. And those results remain today highly questionable. Hasn't it occurred to you that since 2015, the kind of chest thumping and bravado that you had before has disappeared? And there is a feeling among government ministers in particular and leaders of the party today that the Vincentian electorate is uncomfortable with them. And so all like now, they must be thinking of what strategies to use in the next elections. Have they begun to think of what they will order this time? Will they order fertilizers, agricultural products, to try to woo the farming community to vote for them? Would they return with more cement, galvanized lumber, steel to woo the rural folks? Would they seek to find ways of doling out cash? What strategies would they use this time? Because in many respects, they have seen the writing on the wall since 2010. And what they have done is hobble along. Because the promises of change has not materialized. And that if, with all of the fanciful talk and rallies about and on the Argyle International Airport under construction, you did not do better in the elections in 2015. It meant that to the majority of the Vincentian electorate, the political currency of the Argyle International Airport was virtually nil. The electorate had seen and heard about that airport enough. It did not impact the outcome of the 2015 general elections. And if you try to call early elections now, because the dance can't pay for the lights at the airport, economically, your financial wizards have gone silent. And yes, people are now saying what was being said all along. You build an airport, it takes 15 to 20 years to become viable. Even if you got one plane from Europe, one plane from the US a week or two, it's still not going to make it economically viable, because an airport requires a certain amount of traffic for it to become viable. And all you have to do is look around you. Grenada is still not viable. St. Lucia is beginning to emerge, but still not fully viable. Antigua and Barbuda still has problems, and you know what is the status of Barbados. So if we could have allowed Grenada, totally destroyed in 2004 by Hurricane Ivan, to come and run past us and lead us by the veritable nose, we know that we are in dire economic and political straits. But our system of government heaps the coals on the head of the government, the Prime Minister. We have prime ministerial government. And that is why the Prime Minister here was able to say, and when I swivel in the big chair. When I swivel in the big chair, metaphorically, literally there is a big chair. But the metaphor is the level of control. It's a reference to the level of control that I am finally here. And you realize then that you are in charge of the ship of state. And whatever happens to it is not what you tell us we must interpret. It is what we see for ourselves, the reality that we experience, not what you want us to experience. So we operate under a prime ministerial system of government, where the Prime Minister is boss. That's why people could refer to him as Papa. Because in so many instances in the Caribbean, the Prime Ministers recognizing their power, albeit temporal, have the opportunity to become little, or what we call mini dictators, benevolent dictators, little King Tuts, because they believe that they have in their hands the decision-making power that allows them to impact people's lives. And sometimes when you listen to them, you realize how arrogant they have become because they believe that they can control things and people. This is the reason that as far back as we could remember, once our countries in the Caribbean started accessing self-government, we have really had successive generations of authoritarian leaders. They see themselves essentially in practice as the replacement for the masters of old. So while we boast of Massa Day done, the Massa mentality has not dissipated. All that happens is that we have Massas emerging from within our midst. In many respects, we help create the contemporary masters. So psychologically, Massa Day has not yet come and gone. Psychologically, for the vast majority of our people. It is why we remain confused by color. And we refer here to the color of people's skins. It is a mindset that was ingrained for centuries in our people. And so we don't even think about it. And hence we don't always recognize it. The extent to which skin color is still a critical factor in the modus operandi of our respective countries throughout the Caribbean, regardless of language. The current crop of Caribbean prime ministers and presidents remain essentially authoritarian, benevolent dictators who broker no real opposition. You must hear them speak in the corners about their own society, and particularly of their opponents. There is much gloating that becomes and overcomes the holder of the position of prime minister and or president of a country in today's Caribbean. We hear them engage in chest thumping, trying to convince the electorate, since they have already convinced themselves, that whatever is achieved could only have been rendered possible by their own leadership and no one else. They don't take chances. They don't take chances. Waiting for others to sing their praises. They sing it themselves just in case the people forget to do it. And they are always willing minions. People who are willing to do anything to ensure that once they shower praises on themselves, they are then more highly praised. You know, the old people say, you know, when you are genuinely humble, you don't have to say it yourself. Others say that you are humble. Others recognize your humility for you. And that is why the minute any individual gets up and tells you, I am humbled by this, I am humbled by... They're lying. If they were indeed humbled, they would not even have to make mention of it. Their very actions would be characterized by their humility. You don't have to say it. That is one of the hallmarks of humility. That you don't have to mention that you are humble. It is reflected in every single thing that you do. But so many of our people want to become the next big celebrity. And they believe that one of the hallmarks of celebrity is the proclamation of humility. The world judges by different standards. Faith, in the religious sense, allows those who believe to operate under different standards. Even when our leaders have demitted office and others who replace them make progress, they still hold on to their own achievements as having been historic. So they have to remind you, I was the one that built that, Under my leadership, this was achieved, because they are fearful that no one would remember. If your works were such that you somehow feel that as soon as you turn your back, others will forget it, then you must understand what that means. It means that you were not sufficiently important to them. People who make their indelible marks in history did not have to go about boasting of their achievements. That is why they are remembered. But some people are so worried, so bothered, that they would be so quickly forgotten that they try to build all sorts of monuments to themselves and seek to convince the nation. Remember me? I was the only one who could have done this. I was the only one. And successive generations come and say, yeah, you were the only one so stupid to believe that. You were the only one dumb enough to believe that you alone could have done that. Amazing, isn't it? In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we have been hearing the current ruling regime boast of what they have unfortunately labeled labor love. Note we say unfortunately labeled labor love. And Just Another Look has over time taken great pains to inform listeners that the classic evidence of labor love and what it means, what it stands for, is the way in which the ruling regime has been doing and doling out largesse to its supporters. The way in which they have been doling out largesse to their supporters. The gross discrepancy that we observe in terms of who gets what generally, but importantly, who gets what after any sort of disaster in this country under the ULP, is indicative of how the party and the government reveals its love. Think of any disaster, whether it is flooding, the outskirts of a hurricane or storm, or what have you. Remind yourselves of how the rehabilitation work is done. Who gets contracts? Even when we talk about the Lives to Live projects, who gets the cement, the galvanized, the steel, and the lumber? Who gets it? Is it always shared based on needs? Or are the needs predetermined by your political commitment and orientation and your political profession, so that they're absolutely clear who should be the recipients? How are the spoils divided? We bring in millions of dollars of material, and how is it shared? That is an indication of the labor love they profess. And so it came as no surprise some years ago that the major distribution points for cement, lumber, galvanized, and steel appeared to be associated with the candidates. The ULP's display of labor love has apparently created a new low in respect of our beggar-maid policies. The electorate are made to grovel, made to lie prostrate before the system that they must see and accept as their leadership. The average Vincentian, now wilting under the pressure of an economy on the rocks, is only just beginning to understand the true meaning of labor love. The trade union movement in the country has now come to an understanding that the term labor in the concept labor love bears no resemblance. They do not mean the same thing. And one of the most distinguishing features of the ULP's good governance strategy was made manifest in the fracas that took place in this country's parliament in 2011. The fracas began when Anim Eustace refused to take his seat. He was ordered to sit. The then Speaker of the House, Hendrickson Alexander, ordered him to sit. And Eustace remained standing in defiance of that order, with his eyes fixated on the Speaker, Hendrickson Alexander. He said nothing verbally, but his intent was very clear in his silence, in his stance, and his eyes fixated on the Speaker of the House. It was a day that no one sitting on the Parliament's benches had ever seen before in Annim Eustace. And it bothered every single member of Parliament that day. They had never seen that side to him. And so all those who thought they knew him were shell-shocked, not the least of which was the Speaker, Hendrickson Alexander, who was the recipient of the fixation of Annim Eustace's eyes. And Eustace's refusal to sit because of his principled stance resulted in his colleagues all standing as well. From our vantage point, from our analysis, the House panicked. We are convinced that Hendrickson Alexander also panicked, sitting as the Speaker of the House. And then the police were called in to remove the opposition members from the Parliament. But the police removed some members of the opposition, because it remains inexplicable to this day that they did not attempt to touch Annim Eustace, nor did they attempt to touch Sinclair Leacock. Then they removed the others. And Daniel Cummins got the worst of it. Why? We will never really know. But in dragging him outside, there was an attempt, not an attempt, they actually slammed his foot with the heavy door, as his foot kept the door ajar. And they kept banging it, banging it, banging it. Perhaps they were hoping that his foot would break then and there. But it may well have been better for him to have had his foot broken there than what happened afterwards. He was taken and flung down the steps like a rag doll. Swung down the steps by our security forces. They don't do that with common criminals. But an elected member of the nation's legislature, an elected member of the government system, because the parliament is the legislative arm of government. We have the executive, which is the cabinet, the legislature, which is the parliament, and then we have the judiciary, the three arms of government. But our national security forces were brought in and the actions in terms of the way in which they treated those that they chose to remove from parliament may well have been considered worse than how they treat common criminals in the country. So, were they operating under instructions? Were they supervised? And could there have been an intent to injure for life? You know, you wonder if some of these people have children, if they have families, husbands and wives. Just as we asked a while ago at the beginning of this program, what happens when Ralph Gonzalez looks in the mirror? Mirror, mirror on the wall. So these officers who held a parliamentarian and flung him down the stairs like a sack of potatoes, what are they thinking now as they look at themselves in the mirror? As they sit around with their families? What are they thinking now that they see Cummings having been committed to wearing a collar for the next 3 months? Having had one operation on his back and having to return for another and meet his own expenses. What do they think of themselves? When they lifted him to fling him down the steps, what were they hoping for? That he would break his neck? Is that what they were hoping would have achieved? You see, it appears that they were not satisfied that his foot was not broken when they banged the door on it. So they transformed him into a ragdoll and flung him down the steps. Labour's love did not allow for any of the members of the government side in Parliament to put a stop to the fracas. Why? Why? Were they too hoping that somebody would die in the process? How do you, as parliamentary colleagues, albeit on opposing sides, sit and look at what was obviously inhumane treatment of your fellow parliamentarians and stay silent? How do you do that and live with yourself? How do you manage that? How do you return home and sit with your family and eat a meal and not be bothered in your conscience as to what had transpired and of your silence in the process? Did their silence mean consent? Did their silence mean approval? The Minister of National Security. The Minister of National Security, the Prime Minister. What did he do?